I began to realize something about the United States. And I went back to my books and history books and also psychology books with relation to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. As a result of my work in Cambodia, where I was attempting to resolve the consequences of auto-genocide, I began to realize something about the United States. And I went back to my books and history books and also psychology books with relation to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And I realized that the Civil War was really a misnomer for what is often considered the Northern aggression, but in my frame of thinking, it was auto-genocide. In other words, what had happened in Cambodia, where Pol Pot had killed his own people, was very similar to what Abraham Lincoln had done with his own northern and southern warriors, where he set the North against the South. Now, most people, and the way I was taught, and most people learned it this way, it was a war to liberate the slaves. Well, that's not true. Ever since I was a kid, I was mistrustful of that storyline because I came out of France. I came out of an area where there was chaos and actual civil war in France, with French generals blowing up everything. So I began to understand something about America, that the big lie was really a big lie and a historical lie. And as I went back to trace the history of who was Abraham Lincoln, I began to understand that he had Marfan syndrome. Much like Osama bin Laden, he was a tall man with acromegalic features. He had a distension of the aorta and had a history, a documented history of manic depressive illness. He himself had really very little understanding of what the slaves were about and had made pronouncements which were abhorrent according to modern times and even times around the 1830s and 1840s and 50s. He himself had said he did not like blacks. He did not believe that the blacks should be integrated with the whites. He had said in many a statement that he believed that the African American or the black slaves should go back to Africa, or if they were to live in the United States, they were to live in indentured areas and areas like Liberia, where they would be among themselves but away from the white population. Therefore, I compared Abraham Lincoln to Pol Pot and the ruthlessness with which he instigated the Northern aggression. That is, he became a tyrant. And he jailed all the reporters, he jailed the judges, the lawyers, and anybody who would oppose his warmongering tendencies, particularly in the Maryland area and the Mid-Atlantic area, where he literally became a tyrant, not unlike Pol Pot. Then I looked at the evidence, the economic evidence for this war, and it was very clear that in the 1830s, 1840s, both Seward and Stanton, principal members of his cabinet, had already been talking about the need for the North to take over Southern agriculture, convert it to the Northern Industrial Revolution, and utilize or co-opt the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, and New Orleans as a port of entry. And that cotton, which was sold in New York, was a primary product that had to be taken over by the Northern businessmen and not the Southern. So the notion that the entire Civil War was fought for the benefit to free the blacks was wrong. And the fact that the nation state could not secede, or that individual state could not secede from the so-called Republic of the United States of America, was also wrong. It is still in the Constitution. It's both legal and appropriate. But whatever the reason was that he used to rationalize the war, he rationalized it as a real civil war between two different cultures, when in fact it was a form of auto-genocide created for the sole purpose to maintain industrial revolution, to co-opt the agricultural culture of the South. And that fact that he had been a lawyer for the railroad was not insignificant, because he had then allowed the railroad to expand from east to west and west to east. So none of these elements came into our American history, and instead people like Walt Whitman, Carl Sandburg, other historians created a fictitious notion where we had to memorize as children 7 years ago. I mean, absolute nonsense if you look at the words. And when you put it in relation to other countries where they had auto-genocide, you begin to see that Abraham Lincoln, in a fit of his own manic depressive nature, and had a huge homosexual history where he slept with men, but that was not addressed. We totally made up this notion that he was a great gentleman who came out of the Midwest and was an honest Abe, none of which was true. He had Marfan syndrome, he had psychological impediments, and he was very much of a warmongering, representing industrial interest and financial interest from the West, the North, and the East, none of which merged with the South. And eventually, everything that they wanted in the North was in fact realized. And the South became part of the Northern industrialized revolution. New Orleans became the export part for the cotton mills, and everybody was satisfied as long as the North had won. And it wasn't clear that the North would win. But nevertheless, the history that we were taught was totally off mark. It was a dysfunctional way of explaining something that really should have been understood by our own leaders and our own countrymen. But now that we have the internet, and now that people like myself can talk about it, that's one version that I would present to you, the audience, to say, look, he was not a nobleman. This was not a great president of the United States. It's the reverse. He was a nefarious individual with major psychological impediments, who had a major biological problem, a Marfan syndrome, whose intentions had nothing to do with the freeing of any servants or getting rid of apartheid. And in fact, he was very much a product of the railroads, of the Northern industrial complex, and the Northern war machinery. So that's my perspective of history. What's yours?